made amends in 2010 and have been on better terms. In the months that followed, Mustaine cut back on bad-mouthing his former band.
Yeah,
Yes,
boy, isn't that
very much.
something? And are you all happy about that?
No, my son's a drummer. Not happy with that.
Guitar, they'd be the same. I said I could do that, and inside I was going like, what did you just say? So then it became a challenge, and the San Diego Symphony had been run by a guy that I was friends with. He was an MMA guy, and his mom was one of the executives down at San Diego. So the concert happened with me. We did Vivaldi, Bach, and Wagner. And it was challenging because I'm self-taught, so I had to go count the strings and count the notes, and I was going crazy trying to learn Vivaldi because he's such a great. And through all that stuff, we said we need something to blend our fans together with the subscribers to the symphony, because people have those memberships. And long story boring, we said we need something to help everybody get some social lubricant. I thought, well, we don't really want beer, and we don't really want hard liquor, and we decided, since we lived in the wine country in Fallbrook, to do wine. And Pam and I had a friend who took us to a nearby vineyard that was right on the other side of the hill we lived on. And we started tasting it, and it was fun, and we had no idea, because I hate the taste of booze. If I drink, and it's like, that's not me. If I take a sip of something, it's like, ooh, that's nice.
Mustaine And Megadeth.
Emotional confrontation where they address their issues with each other. The meeting was filmed and included in the documentary Metallica, Some Kind of Monster.
Things between Slayer's Tom Araya and Megadeth's Dave Mustaine have never really been smooth. But what Araya just said has fans seriously worried. Why did it take so long for him to speak up? What really happened that made so many metal legends turn their backs on Mustaine? And could it all trace back to one drunken outburst and a broken guitar nearly 40 years ago? Araya's words now sound calm, but there's a heavy history behind them. A history full of tension, missed chances, and broken trust. Is this just old drama being stirred up again? Or are we finally seeing the truth behind one of thrash metal's most chaotic stories? To know everything about this, stay tuned till the very end. Things really started to fall apart the night Dave Mustaine walked into the studio in 1986, completely drunk. No one was ready for what happened next. He didn't just argue or throw a fit. He took it way too far. He smashed a one-of-a-kind guitar worth thousands of dollars right there in front of everyone. The label had spent big money on that guitar, but what they didn't expect was how that one moment would open the door to something much worse. What followed was a chain of disasters that didn't just wreck equipment. It wrecked friendships, tore apart working relationships, and left a long list of musicians saying they'd never work with him again. Metal icons like Tom Araya were done. They didn't just distance themselves, they wanted nothing to do with Mustaine anymore. It wasn't just the broken guitar, it was everything that came with it. The yelling, the threats, the tension that filled the room whenever he was around. The record label ended up losing millions from delayed projects and cancelled tours. Even worse, some bands fell apart completely because no one could deal with Mustaine's behavior. His former bandmates started telling people behind the scenes that playing a small gig in someone's garage sounded better than spending another minute in a studio with him. But Mustaine didn't always used to be like that. He was born on September 13, 1961, in La Mesa, California. His real name is David Scott Mustaine, and his early life wasn't easy. He grew up with a violent, alcoholic father, and those scars stuck with him. Music became his way to escape the chaos at home. By the time he was 17, he was already playing in bands, teaching himself how to play guitar faster and harder than anyone else around him. His fingers could fly across the strings, and other kids would stop and just watch. Even when he wasn't in class or doing anything else, he was locked in with his guitar, trying to perfect his skills. He studied older rock guitarists, picking up the speed and style that would soon help shape an entire genre. Then came 1981. That was the year everything changed. He joined Metallica after responding to an ad put out by Lars Ulrich and James Hetfield. He didn't even bring an amp to the audition. He plugged his guitar into someone else's and played solos so intense that no one said a word until he stopped. He was in the band, just like that. While he was there, he helped write songs that would become some of Metallica's biggest early hits. But even back then, people started noticing his angry outbursts and unpredictable behavior. The talent was there. No one could deny that. But so were the problems. And over time, those problems became harder and harder to ignore. That's why so many in the metal community eventually backed away. What started as frustration turned into fear. Nobody wanted to be the next person caught in the crossfire of another one of his meltdowns. The damage he did wasn't just loud, it was lasting. Dave Mustaine's time with Metallica didn't end in flames. It ended in cold silence and a one-way bus ticket. Things had been rocky for a while. He was drinking heavily, using drugs, and getting into fights with the band. His mood could change in seconds, and that tension was always in the room. Metallica couldn't take it anymore. In April 1983, while the band was in New York preparing to record their debut album Kill 'Em All, they made a decision that shocked even their closest friends. They woke Dave up early one morning, handed him a Greyhound ticket back to California, and told him he was out. No warnings, no goodbye party, just gone. The fact that no one even let him speak for himself made it even more brutal. It felt like betrayal. That long bus ride across the country from New York to California is now a legend in metal history. But back then, for Mustaine, it was pure anger and silence. Hours and hours with nothing but thoughts of payback. People say he sat there, staring out the window, already planning how he'd come back bigger and louder than ever. And by the time he stepped off that bus, Dave wasn't just bitter, he was ready to prove a point. Later that year, he formed a new band with bassist David Ellefson. He named it Megadeth, taken from a term that referred to 1 million deaths from nuclear war. That name wasn't just edgy, it was a message. He didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to destroy every doubt about him. From the start, Megadeth was fast, sharp, and full of rage. Mustaine wasn't interested in sounding like Metallica. He wanted to blow past them. The band quickly became known for its intense speed, technical riffs, and aggressive lyrics. But while Mustaine was building something new, other metal figures were quietly keeping their distance. Some, like Tom Araya, were watching from afar. Tom Araya's story couldn't be more different. He was born on June 6, 1961, in Viña del Mar, Chile, and moved to Southgate, California, with his family when he was just a kid. Unlike Mustaine, Araya came from a home that was steady and full of hard work. His dad worked at a leather factory, and both parents made sure their children knew how important it was to stay grounded. Music came into Araya's life through his older brother, who introduced him to bands like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. At first, Tom just played bass to support his brother, but that soon turned into a deep passion. What's shocking is that even as Slayer was gaining fame, Araya was still working a day job as a respiratory therapist. While other musicians were partying or losing themselves in fame, he was helping people breathe in hospitals. It shows just how disciplined and focused he was, the complete opposite of Mustaine's chaos. That contrast wasn't lost on the metal community. Araya was respected, trusted, and easy to work with. Mustaine, on the other hand, had already burned so many bridges by then that most artists didn't even pick up the phone when his name came up. People in the industry started whispering about how working with Mustaine meant taking a risk, not just musically, but emotionally and professionally. Bands were growing afraid that one session with him could lead to fights, delays, or even lawsuits. And for guys like Araya, who took their craft seriously and kept their heads down, that kind of chaos just wasn't worth it. In the early 1980s, something powerful was brewing in the world of heavy metal. Tom Araya had teamed up with Kerry King and Jeff Hanneman to form Slayer in 1981. Their sound wasn't just loud, it was terrifyingly fast, dark, and intense. Meanwhile, Dave Mustaine had bounced back from his messy exit from Metallica and was now leading Megadeth, determined to outdo everyone with sharp, aggressive riffs and furious speed. By 1986, both Slayer and Megadeth were making serious waves in the thrash metal scene. Slayer's album, Rain in Blood, produced by Rick Rubin, was shaking the metal world with its brutal speed. On the other side, Megadeth had just released Peace Sells, But Who's Buying?, showcasing Mustaine's skill and his sharp, intense songwriting. Thrash metal was growing fast, and though it was filled with rivalry, there was still a strong sense of connection between bands. They played shows together, inspired each other, and even talked about working on joint projects. One of those talks led to something big. In late 1986, record labels, Combat Records for Megadeth and Def Jam for Slayer, came up with a bold plan. A split EP featuring both bands, followed by a massive co-headlining tour across North America. It would have been a dream for fans and a huge win for the labels. Everything was lined up. Studio booked, producers ready, and meetings arranged. A key meeting was set for a Wednesday at 1 p.m. in a studio in Los Angeles. Everyone from Slayer showed up on time. Araya, King, Hanneman, and Lombardo. They were known for keeping things professional, even if their music sounded like chaos. Reps from both labels were there, along with engineers and producers. Megadeth's bassist, David Ellefson, also showed up, looking uneasy. He apologized, saying Dave Mustaine was on his way. But the clock kept ticking. 1 hour passed, then 2. Phone calls to Mustaine went straight to voicemail. Studio time was expensive, and patience was running out. At first, Slayer waited calmly, but their frustration was building. Then, sometime after 4 p.m., over 3 hours late, Dave Mustaine finally walked in, and things got bad fast. Witnesses say he was clearly drunk. He stumbled through the door, his speech slurred, and walked straight into the control room where Araya and a producer were talking. Without any greeting or explanation, Mustaine cut in, loudly criticizing Slayer's Rain in Blood production. He called it messy and unbalanced, claiming Megadeth's sound was tighter and more refined. The room went silent. Everyone felt the tension. Kerry King, never one to stay quiet, snapped back with a jab about Megadeth's live performances, accusing them of being sloppy and inconsistent. Things escalated. Mustaine tried to laugh it off, but the damage was already done. The meeting was effectively over before it had even begun. Label reps tried to keep things calm, but the vibe in the room was already toxic. Araya, quiet but clearly disappointed, stood up and left the control room. Slayer wasn't going to deal with this kind of disrespect, especially not after hours of waiting. After that, the collaboration idea completely fell apart. The split EP was scrapped, and the joint tour never happened. It could have been a historic moment for thrash metal, but Mustaine's behavior that day burned any chance of it. Behind the scenes, word spread fast. Mustaine's name became linked with chaos, unreliability, and confrontation. People who once admired his talent began to keep their distance. For Slayer, this was the last straw. They had no interest in ever working with Mustaine again. What should have been a milestone for metal history ended up as just another warning about what happens when talent is overshadowed by trouble. What happened next inside that Los Angeles studio still haunts the metal scene decades later. After Kerry King took a jab at Dave Mustaine, saying something like, "At least we can play our songs live without messing them up," the room shifted. Everyone could feel it. Mustaine's face tightened. His eyes locked onto something across the room. King's custom BC Rich Warlock guitar. That guitar wasn't just some prop. It had a jagged, unique body and had been designed specifically for King's aggressive playing style. It was worth thousands of dollars and meant a lot to him, not just in money, but in pride. And in a sudden outburst, Mustaine stormed across the room, yanked the guitar from its stand and in front of everyone, slammed it against a nearby amplifier with brutal force. The neck cracked. The body shattered. Pieces of the guitar flew in different directions and hit the floor hard. For a few seconds, no one said a word. You could only hear the broken pieces settling on the floor. Then all hell broke loose. Kerry King lunged straight at Mustaine, shouting, but Dave Lombardo and Jeff Hanneman held him back. Araya, usually calm and quiet, had to step in the middle and try to calm things down, though it was clear he was shaken. David Ellefson, Megadeth's bassist, looked horrified. He tried to apologize, clearly embarrassed by what his bandmate had just done. But it was way too late. The damage wasn't just physical. It was personal, deep, something you don't walk back from. The label executives were stunned. They quickly shut down the meeting and escorted a furious King out of the room. Araya stayed behind, trying to talk to the studio crew and the label reps, probably just to smooth things over. But even he knew it was over. Years later, in a 2010 interview, Araya talked about the moment. He said it was never just about the guitar. Sure, King was furious. It had been one of his most prized instruments, but what hurt more was the lack of respect. Not just toward King, but toward everyone in that room, toward the bands, the labels, the fans. People had worked hard to bring the two sides together. and in a single violent act, Mustaine had destroyed it all. The fallout was fast and brutal. The split EP and tour plans were cancelled right away. Combat Records, who had backed Megadeth, seriously considered suing Mustaine for blowing the whole deal, but they backed off, afraid of how the media might react. Still, they were furious behind the scenes. Rick Rubin, the respected producer who had pushed for this collaboration, was so disappointed that he reportedly told people he'd never work with Mustaine or Megadeth again. The financial loss was huge. Industry insiders said the cancelled project could have brought in $2 to $3 million, a massive deal for that time. But money wasn't the worst part. The real damage was to Megadeth's reputation. Within days, people across the metal community were talking. Word spread fast. Mustaine had smashed King's guitar, wrecked a huge project, and insulted everyone involved. For many in the industry, that was it. They saw him not just as difficult, but dangerous to work with. Even people who liked his music started thinking twice before getting too close. What could have been a legendary team-up between two of thrash metal's biggest bands had turned into a complete disaster, and the scars it left didn't heal quickly, if at all. What happened after the studio meltdown didn't just stay between Slayer and Megadeth, it spread like wildfire through the entire metal scene. Bands that had once thought about working with Megadeth suddenly backed away. No one wanted to deal with another outburst like the one with Kerry King's smashed guitar. Promoters became nervous too. Some even refused to book Megadeth unless they were given extra guarantees or security deposits. The vibe around the band had changed. People didn't just see them as aggressive musicians anymore. They saw them as a risky act, and Dave Mustaine's behavior was now the center of that concern. While Megadeth's reputation was taking a hit, Slayer actually came out of the situation stronger. The chaos brought them even closer to bands like Metallica, Anthrax, and Exodus. These friendships built trust, and that trust led to some of the biggest thrash tours in history. One of those was the Clash of the Titans tour in 1990 and 1991. It featured all the major names in the thrash scene, except for Megadeth during the European leg. That wasn't by accident. People behind the scenes simply didn't want to deal with the potential issues, and those feelings weren't hidden. In a brutally honest 1991 interview, Kerry King said he'd rather open for a completely unknown garage band than ever be on the same stage as Mustaine again. That quote did damage. It made the feud between the bands feel permanent, not just a one-time thing. Even when Megadeth did get added to the US leg of the Clash of the Titans tour, things were tense. The bands barely talked to each other. There were no backstage hangouts, no friendly moments. Everyone kept their distance, and at major festivals during the 90s, organizers often went out of their way to make sure Megadeth and Slayer performed on different days. Or if they had to be there at the same time, they were placed as far apart as possible. When they did cross paths, it was said to be cold and uncomfortable. No shouting matches, no chaos, but no warmth either, just silence. Tom Araya, Slayer's bassist and usually the calmest guy in the band, never got too public about how he felt. But even he kept a wide distance from Mustaine. In a few rare interviews, Araya hinted that it wasn't about personal hate. It was about professionalism. He felt Megadeth operated in a way that made it hard for other bands to trust them. He didn't name-call. He didn't rant. He just quietly chose not to engage. Meanwhile, Mustaine was going through some of the darkest years of his life. His issues with addiction became more serious, and it began to show in Megadeth's performances. Some shows were sloppy, and fans noticed. Behind the scenes, the band was constantly changing members. Guitarists, bassists, and drummers came and went at a rate that was almost hard to believe. Megadeth had more lineup changes than almost any other major metal band of that time, and people started asking why no one could stick around. Industry insiders whispered about how hard it was to work with Mustaine. The tension, the unpredictability. It all became too much for many musicians. The combination of a broken industry reputation, personal grudges, and internal chaos could have ended Megadeth for good. And for a while, it looked like that might happen. Other bands were getting tighter, growing stronger, and sharing stages. But Megadeth stood apart, isolated and unpredictable. What could have been one of the most powerful unions in thrash metal history ended in shattered guitars, burned bridges, and lost trust. And even though the feud didn't always make the headlines, the damage it did was long-lasting and hard to forget. By the time the 1990s hit their halfway point, something strange was happening to heavy metal. It was disappearing from the spotlight. Thrash metal, which once felt unstoppable, was being pushed aside by grunge. The loud, aggressive sound that once dominated stages was no longer what record labels were looking for. Suddenly, the industry wanted moody lyrics, slower tempos, and bands in flannel shirts. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden were everywhere. For many metal bands, this change hit hard. They had to either evolve quickly or risk being forgotten. Slayer didn't budge. They stayed brutal, fast and fierce, no matter what the trend was. But Megadeth, led by Dave Mustaine, started making changes. Albums like Countdown to Extinction and Euthanasia sounded cleaner and more mainstream. While some fans liked the new direction, others saw it as the beginning of a slow decline, and that was hard to accept. But the biggest shock didn't come from the changing music. It came from Mustaine himself. In 2002, he suffered a serious arm injury. A nerve in his left arm was badly damaged, and doctors warned that he might never play guitar again. For a man who had built his entire life and career around shredding riffs, that was a nightmare. He went from being on stage in front of thousands to lying in a hospital bed, wondering if everything he'd worked for was gone forever. That kind of fear can break a person. And for a while, Mustaine truly did hit rock bottom. He felt like his world had collapsed. But something unexpected started to happen while he was healing. During this painful and uncertain time, Mustaine began changing, not just physically, but mentally. He decided to walk away from the drugs and alcohol that had haunted him for years. He turned to faith, found strength in Christianity, and started to see his life through a different lens. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about finally facing everything he'd run from. The fights, the grudges, the bridges he'd burned, including with Slayer and Metallica, started to look different. Instead of anger, there was reflection. Meanwhile, Tom Araya from Slayer had his own problems. Years of aggressive headbanging had badly damaged his neck. In 2010, he had to get serious surgery to fix it. After that, Araya couldn't perform the way he used to. He had to move more carefully and think more seriously about his health. That forced him to slow down and reflect on his career, the scene he had helped build, and the arguments that had followed him for years. These physical struggles had a way of changing people. Both Araya and Mustaine were no longer the wild young men who threw verbal punches in interviews and backstage halls. They had scars, both physical and emotional. Then came something no one expected. At the 2004 Download Festival in the UK, members of Slayer and Megadeth were spotted quietly speaking backstage. It was brief, but shocking. Fans and media had long believed these two bands would never even stand in the same room again. The fact that they were talking at all was a small but important moment. It wasn't peace, but it also wasn't war anymore. But the biggest surprise came in 2010. The four biggest thrash bands, Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax, announced they would all perform together in a series of concerts known as the Big Four. For metal fans, this sounded like a dream that could never come true. These bands had too much bad history, too many fights, and too many personal issues. But somehow, they made it happen. The first concerts were in Europe, and then they brought the tour to the US, ending with a huge show at Yankee Stadium. People who had followed these bands for decades couldn't believe it. These were the same people who once refused to talk to each other, now sharing a stage. Now, just because they played together didn't mean they became friends overnight. Behind the scenes, things were kept respectful, but distant. Mustaine didn't spend much time with the others. Araya stayed professional, but didn't go out of his way to be social. They spoke when needed, nodded when passing each other backstage, but it was clear the old wounds hadn't fully healed. Still, they were able to be in the same place, play the same songs, and give the fans what they wanted, something that once seemed impossible. This wasn't just a concert tour. It was the result of years of pain, recovery, change, and maybe even regret. These bands had hurt each other, publicly and privately. Their feuds had shaped metal history. But now, they were showing that even the loudest fights don't have to last forever. The broken guitar from that explosive night in 1986 was more than just smashed wood and strings. It was the start of a bitter silence that lasted for decades. But as the years rolled on, that fiery anger slowly gave way to quiet reflection. Both Tom Araya of Slayer and Dave Mustaine of Megadeth began to talk, carefully and cautiously, about the feud that had once defined so much of their early careers. These weren't dramatic statements or tearful apologies, but subtle, thoughtful comments that showed how much time and pain had passed. Araya, known for keeping his thoughts close to the chest, finally opened up in 2018 during an interview. He didn't pretend they were friends or act like all was forgiven, but he did something rare. He gave Mustaine credit. He spoke of the respect he had developed over time for Mustaine's stubborn dedication and his deep influence on heavy metal. "We were young, and everyone had issues," Araya said. "Dave's were just more out in the open. But in the end, we gave fans something special, and that's what should be remembered." That was a huge shift from the silence and tension that had once followed them around backstage and on tour. Mustaine had been opening up even earlier. In his brutally honest 2010 autobiography, Mustaine, a heavy metal memoir, he laid out just how chaotic his life had been. Addiction, anger, and ambition had controlled his every move. In a 2016 interview with Rolling Stone, he didn't sugarcoat anything. "I burned a lot of bridges. Some I've fixed, some I never will. And I've accepted that." It wasn't just about Araya or Slayer. It was about everything. The fights, the interviews filled with insults, the years spent obsessed with proving himself. It had all come at a price. But now, he was trying to live with what he couldn't change. What happened between Slayer and Megadeth wasn't just about two men not getting along. It was about what happens when young artists are thrown into a world of loud music, fast fame, endless touring, and too many temptations. The metal scene of the 1980s was wild and unpredictable. One moment you were broke and angry. The next, you were being called a legend and living in hotel rooms filled with chaos. Not everyone was ready for that kind of life. And not everyone made it through without doing damage, to themselves or others. For Araya, everything that happened in the wake of that feud only made his belief in staying professional stronger. While Slayer's music was aggressive and violent in sound, the band had built a reputation for showing up, doing the work, and staying solid. Araya even continued working as a respiratory therapist for a while, long after Slayer had become one of the biggest names in metal. While others lost control, he stayed connected to the real world, maybe because he'd seen how easy it was to lose yourself in the noise. Mustaine's story moved in a different direction. He started out as a fiery guitarist full of rage and revenge, especially after being kicked out of Metallica. For years, it seemed like he was constantly trying to prove he was better than the band that replaced him. But over time, especially after surviving addiction and a serious injury that nearly ended his ability to play, Mustaine began to change. He didn't become someone else, but he stopped being stuck in the past. He started looking forward instead of always looking back. And he began to speak more kindly about those he once blamed for everything. In 2019, when Slayer announced they were officially retiring and launching their final tour, fans hoped for one last surprise. A real, public reconciliation with Megadeth. Maybe a joint performance. Maybe a shared moment on stage. But it never happened. No dramatic reunion. No tearful hugs. Just quiet speculation and a lot of whispers online. What did happen, though, was something much smaller, but just as powerful in its own way. At a festival where both bands were performing, Araya and Mustaine were seen having a short conversation. Not on stage, not in front of cameras, just backstage, away from the noise. No one knows exactly what was said. The details have never been shared, but people who saw it described the moment as calm, respectful. For two men whose past included screaming fights and long silences, that quiet talk was a big deal. It may not have been a grand apology or a dramatic final act, but it was something. A small human moment that said the anger had faded, and what remained was two older men, no longer fighting, just speaking. After everything that had happened since that violent guitar-smashing night, that short, calm exchange might have been the true ending no one expected. Even now, decades later, the shadows of that fallout still linger. Tom Araya and Dave Mustaine have both cemented their names in heavy metal history. Slayer wrapped up their final tour in 2019, leaving behind nearly 40 years of brutal music that shook the industry. On the other hand, Mustaine is still on the road with Megadeth, pushing through lineup changes, personal demons, and even a frightening diagnosis of throat cancer in 2019 that threatened not just his voice, but his life. But despite their legendary status, the question still echoes among metal fans. Why do so many artists keep their distance from Mustaine? The answer isn't simple, and that's what makes it even more chilling. It's not just about one fight or one smashed guitar. It's about a long, uneasy history full of tension, broken trust, and the kind of stubbornness that makes people walk away even when success is within reach. Over the years, the story has become more than just gossip. It's a warning, a lesson in how personal battles can twist even the most powerful creative forces into something toxic. As Araya and Mustaine step into their 60s, it's clear that age has brought a colder, calmer view of the past. The loud arguments, the bitter words, and the silence that followed. They've all been absorbed into the bigger picture of what thrash metal was and what it became. Neither of them could have predicted this when they were just teenagers, holding guitars and chasing a dream that would eventually change their lives forever. But that dream also came with a price. In 2020, Araya was asked about Mustaine. His answer wasn't dramatic, but it left a strange chill in the air. We made different choices, took different paths, but we were both there when it all began. That connects us, whether we want it to or not. That's the kind of truth that's hard to shake off. For the metal community, this lingering connection is more than just history. It's a reminder that behind the face-melting riffs and screaming fans, there were real people, dealing with pain, pride, and the pressure of being larger than life. And in the middle of it all, a feud that never fully healed, a wound that still quietly bleeds through every retelling of metal's darkest legends. Do you remember Tom Araya? Who was your favorite? Do let us know in the comment section below, and for more such amazing videos, do subscribe to our channel.